Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Center for South Asia at Stanford. My name is Shil, and I teach modern South Asian history at the Department of History at Stanford here. Before we begin, we would like to read out our land acknowledgement statement. We recognize that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We are grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity with indigenous struggles. Our speaker today is Professor Sudhir Chella Rajan. Professor Rajan teaches in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He did his doctorate from University of California, Los Angeles in environmental science and engineering, and has worked in government, research consultancies, NGOs, and academia. His interests are primarily at the interface of political theory and the environment, in particular on the new challenges that enter politics within democratic societies in the face of composite social and environmental encounters. Professor Rajan has worked, among other things, on emergent policy dilemmas in automobile pollution regulation in California, the politics of power sector reform in developing countries, ethical approaches to addressing climate change and sea level rise, changes to the peri-urban landscape in South India, and the shifting meanings of corruption in environmental and everyday discourse. His latest book is A Social History of Corruption, Notes from the Indian Subcontinent, and this is indeed the topic of his presentation today. Professor Rajan's talk will be followed by a Q&A session, and I request all of you to please send us your question in the Q&A box. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sudhir Chella Rajan and inviting him to begin his talk.
Thank you very much, Parth, for these kind words, and to Lalita and Simrat and yourself for this very kind invitation. I'm going to share a screen, so let me try and get that started. Okay. So I'm going to say a few words about my book, which is now about 18 months old, but I want to try and get to it by, perhaps answering a few questions that have arisen these several months, and then, of course, I'll try and describe a couple of themes from the book as well, and I'll try to do all this in about 30 minutes or so. So let me begin with this somewhat buried quote from Cornelius Castoriadis, and I quote, "For terrestrial beings, radio waves do not exist. They are not elements belonging to the ensemble of information defined for and by these automata, whereas sun rays do exist for the majority of these beings, but they are one thing for plants and quite another for sea turtles." So he goes on to say, it can be said that the living being constitutes part of the objective world for itself, that it establishes within this part a division between relevant and irrelevant subsets, that within the first it makes new subdivisions, defining classes of events according to their properties, in accordance with fixed programs, etc., etc., that can be extremely complex, end quote. So what I think Castoriadis is getting at here is a mode of speculative realism, which I share with him, but of course cannot express half as eloquently. But to summarize, what I think he's saying is human experience for speculative realists, as well as others, is that process of making out the world through one's senses and feeling one's way through it using discursive or sign-based logics and practice performances. To exist, therefore, is not such a profound condition of possibility of experiencing and describing something, but rather it's simply more the entire collection of emergent processes of an ensemble of life actions in a field of material effects. And that's also why I want to begin by shedding any traces of metaphysics from the social science reasoning that I want to develop in this work, and hence, this image about climate change and the impact that it has on ways of thinking. So why corruption, and what do I understand by corruption? So I think it's useful to think about that word by first examining our everyday lives alongside fantasies we may have about dark forms of conspiracy. Why is it, for instance, that our bodily intentions to enjoy Candy Crush or Instagram, Twitter, or Amazon just happen to be collectivized and commercially sold to serve enormous profits for a remarkably small set of actors? Why was it similar about a generation or so ago, but that time with tobacco companies, sports teams, Coca-Cola playing similar roles? Of course, sports teams and their sponsors still do. And then we might want to ask, what is advertising doing here? What varieties of habitus reshape themselves across vast populations in ways that seem almost perfectly designed to serve large organizations having tiny boards? So one of my great heroes of social theory, Norbert Elias, posed an almost identical question in his fabulous Court Society. And I quote again here. Under what conditions are social positions of monopoly rule formed that confer on their incumbents far greater powers than other social positions? Why really do hundreds of thousands of people, not only in crisis situations, but as part of the normal routine of social life, obey a single man? And in the case of kings, not only a single man during his lifetime, but perhaps his son and grandson. In short, the members of a particular family for several generations. So we might say that cabals can indeed be found everywhere. Are they then social facts in whatever sense of universal category that term represents? And can social facts as processes spawned by intentional subjects in intersubjective material spaces be created and supported through interlocking networks? And if they do they coalesce in certain fortunate and politically advantageous circumstances to form patterns of domination and extreme inequality, while even as they reproduce popular cultures of consent? So these are all indeed intriguing possibilities and have been suggested in different ways by hosts of scholars in the human sciences, at least starting with Marx. And I must confess that my book is too sketchy and too vague to provide much confirmation of this broad consensual program or understanding, although I hope it sharpens the debate by using the less familiar language of corruption. So here then is my speculative realist philosophy of corruption. Seeing patterns of crime and learning from them is the art of detectives and investigative reporters. The corruption researchers I respect most are ethnographers who pay careful attention to the details of multiple cases, but then go on to develop a gestalt understanding or interpretation of the field as a whole. Each incident framed across different time scales and spatial contexts, but always revealing the roles of extraction, protection, and war making, helps define a particular type of or particular case of territorial strategy. So among my most exciting of corruption researchers, of course, is Machiavelli, whose many insights were drawn on his rich historical, which is to say narrativized examples on the corruption of the people. So I'm therefore very proud to be in such august company. Still, I would draw distinctions between my argument and that of a few of my contemporary fellow travelers. So as an example, let me try and contrast the way in which I treat corruption with what I think Akhil Gupta is doing in his remarkable Red Tape. So I'm certainly in agreement with most parts of his argument. Gupta writes that corruption narratives help construct people's constitution of the state. And so recall here what Castoriadis says above about living beings constituting parts of the objective worlds for themselves. So With Gupta, I agree that once the state idea becomes stable, a stable part of the social imaginary, it is hegemonic. But he also seems to take the position that corruption is only or solely defined by narratives about it, from which it might be surmised that it cannot actually be deemed a universal category. And I quote, corruption may also be such a fecund signifier because it serves as a site for debates prompted by conflictual systems of moral and ethical behavior. And therefore, he says, at what scale does one employ to determine what is morally right? In most cases, the scale used is the one embedded in legal definitions of corruption and therefore external interpretations of the word. And he goes on to describe why he's skeptical towards this definition, given the fictitious character of the role-playing Weberian bureaucrat who's assumed in all these official renderings of corruption. And he goes on to say, if there is no widespread agreement about which scale is to be used, correct ethical behavior, the social judgment of corruption can often be contentious and fractured. So I find this treatment odd, because if one is describing social degeneration, one need not place such a strong moral frame to judge it, which means that corruption is not necessarily a contentious social process to chronicle with relative or differential treatments of it. A society where the best brokers and their official connections always decide how street-level encounters with the government are negotiated will indeed produce a people who constitute their state as such, an endless battlefield of wits and wealth-making. In contrast, if you look at barbarian states such as Germany or even Italy, they are constituted differently. And they're different from the scenes that Gupta describes based on mostly poor rural India. In the former cases, to different degrees, the vision of the Leviathan is as the sovereign, impartial protector of the social order. And at least during street-level encounters with the public, this seems to be a familiar theme. But that vision can also be cracked with public fury when senior and constitutionally entrusted power holders are found to make up their own rules or sleep with corporate giants, as we saw in the case of the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers. In different parts of the world, then, state-making operates at different registers that altogether highlight the historicity of certain strategies of territory. Each of their corruption syndromes then have long storylines and associated cultures. So here, therefore, I'm drawing on rather different and older interpretations of corruption as degeneration or societal degeneration, and don't follow today's official definition, which is the abuse of public office for private gain. So Gupta may indeed be using corruption in a very different way than I am. But while I don't necessarily have to therefore take the opposite route of building or defining and defending a universal category of corruption, I think there is value to building ideal types to scaffold and thereby interpret these as different syndromes or patterns. So what is the Anthropocene best understood as? Anthropocene as a process of land use change as much as everything else. And I think that's usually missed out in discussions of the Anthropocene, and I think that's an odd and unfortunate error. Because historians like anthropologists are typically distrustful of comparative analysis and synthesis, but the Anthropocene has given us reason to believe that some of this derision is ill-founded. It should now seem obvious that capitalism is a macro-social force that has worked in conjunction with imperial power and colonial rule to produce globalizing effects of extreme inequality and violence through stupefying and earth-shattering forms of war-making and ecological destruction. So what I'm calling corruption follows a familiar tradition of societal decay, by which is usually meant the betrayal of moral order or justice, because of the continued reproduction of gendered power of everyday social order. So the words in Chinese, Tamil, and Old English, Fubai, Ural, or Kurampure, respectively, all mean the same thing: the rotting of any semblance of moral forms of sociality that are collectively practiced through everyday performances of supposed mutual trust. And behind these discoveries of rottenness are territorial modes of rent-seeking, which have since ancient Egypt and Shang China operated as widely warranted patterns of territorial protection and violent and disciplined speculative expansion. The critique of historicism, which was best expressed in Dipesh Chakrabarty's booming question, "Who speaks of India's past?" should therefore not be applicable in this context. Corruption is a matter of importance for all of humanity in almost exactly the same way that capitalism or climate change now are. It is certainly not an invention of the World Bank or of Transparency International or any other dark interest out to colonize the global South once again, although imperial strategies founded on colonial logics may otherwise be at work. I therefore treat corruption as a universal signifier, but one having different signatures or syndromes in a fecund variety of contexts, both past and present. The variety of narratives of legally defined corruption, as much as the discursive valorization of its principal regime types across contexts, namely monarchical dynasties, leads me to believe that something common is present across these types, giving us some clues into the character of the persistent politics of domination. For the one common feature of societal rotting and betrayal is that they're almost all found only in territorial regimes whose own signature in the human past is universal, but of recent vintage, a mere 300 to 500 years old in most parts of the globe. Which leads us to this peculiar word state, a transparently fictitious term. Its existence is validated only through discursive and performative processes. Thus, it has to be continually reenacted in its multiple relationships in order to give it that semblance of powerful unity and entity. The power of the state is amplified, Gupta reminds us, by the way, in which people perform and continue to reproduce supplicant and other actions before bureaucrats, especially the senior ones, and interpolate the law precisely by finding ways around it and thereby strengthening its potency. In a much cited study, John Paget and Christopher Ansell showed that Cosimo de' Medici used marriages to increase the power of his family. In this way, the Medici family maintained what network scholars call betweenness centrality for themselves, while ensuring structural holes in the network so that only they would hold key positions as brokers. Cosimo de' Medici operated very much like a modern crime boss. Paget and Ansell used the term sphinx, who harnessed power by exploiting the very arcane network conditions that he and his inner circle managed to create. And I quote here from Paget and Ansell, they say, to understand state building, very interesting, the word state building, one needs to penetrate beneath the veneer of formal institutions and apparently clear goals down to the relational substratum of people's actual lives. The state, therefore, turns out to be this deliberate misconstruction by statists, defenders of a type of territorial authority that takes on a superhuman, natural, institutional form. The 17th century Treaty of Westphalia got conveniently mythologized by a whole set of international relations theorists as the origin story of the modern territorial state. Statist and geopolitical studies of the territorial impulse are therefore self-fulfilling prophecies, taking their power and its legitimacy for granted, but without asking what the internal effects of these prophecies are on people and the social practices that they spawn. Corruption, on the other hand, is both related to and more real than these state processes, in that it connotes the performances of human agents of elite networks, mostly hidden dark forces that are responsible for the bulk of social injustice, violence, and systemic exploitation in everyday life. Moreover, over the longue durée, the persistent narratives, histories or itihasa, and performative dispositif of changing cultures help to maintain certain configurations and legacies of elite network families and relationships in relation to the everyday servicing performances of ordinary people. I'm not a philosopher of history, and so my speculations might seem naive to someone who is. Still, I feel there's not enough to connect these different discursive apparatuses of sovereign power across global contexts, except for a few counterexamples. And here I should point to this, the magnificent 2-volume Oxford World History of Empire by Peter Bang, Chris Bailey, and Walter Scheidel, which shows how territorial power operated precisely on this principle. And certainly Charles Tilly made the point differently for the longue durée of Europe, arguing that what we now call state making was predicated entirely on protection, extraction, and war making by elite structures of power until Republican revolutions managed to procure some compromises with the patrician classes. So, in its earliest formations, territory was produced through coercion and the creation of what James C. Scott calls Neolithic settlement camps. And these were initially in the Levant, in Harappa, in the Indus Valley, and the Huanghe Valley in China. Two of these areas spawned emergent strategies of colonial, settler colonialism, namely the Levant and China, and trade networks and empire. The Harappan case, not so much. So what's remarkable is how it seemingly collapsed or sort of fell apart, depending on how you want to describe those processes. So these strategies of these territorial powers co-created social practices and discourses and patterns of rent collection that became normalized, so that the ways of living they demanded, their cultural modalities, became hegemonic. That is why we can call them imperial strategies or syndromes of corruption. The everyday practices of households had to conform themselves to the patterns that just so happened to suit the needs of empire. The one common feature of this societal rotting and betrayal is that they are almost all found only in territorial regimes whose own signature in the human sciences is universal. So grand corruption is a certain kind of degeneration of societies that takes place in the longue durée and is characterized by different degrees and forms of extreme inequality, networks or hives or dens of gangs linked together spatially, what Monica Smith calls corridor territoriality. And all of this helps to maintain territorial authority, patterns of popular accommodation, which get ossified in material ritual cultures and which only occasionally experience crises. The degeneration or decay may only be evident when injustices for the poorest get amplified, when the uber wealthy and powerful engage in excessive or extreme forms of violence, as in ancient Rome, alongside their own personal and familial decadence, and sometimes when there is societal withdrawal and anomie, even in the midst of economic prosperity and relative territorial peace. Corruption in the Anthropocene is, by this interpretation, the large-scale betrayal of the majority of humanity and Earth systems through capitalism's tantalizing promise of progress made or achievable through technology and commodity-based welfare. So after all these prefatory remarks, let me move to a couple of the themes from the book. So between 2600 and 1900 BCE in northwestern India, Pakistan, and parts of the Swat Valley in Afghanistan, there flourished more than 1,000 cities of varying sizes that were strikingly similar in form and artifacts across 500,000 square miles. These network cities displayed multiple scales and activities of ancient industrialization, the production of shell and stone-based jewelry, technologies of construction, water engineering, trade and shipping, and urban planning. These were organized into similarly aligned routines in multiple sites across an enormous area, even while they had local variations. At least a few 100,000 people in each generation enacted the spatial rhythms of the Harappan economy, including the maintenance of cities and their material flows. What was this nature and size? What is the nature of this of authority that operated in this vast region in Harappa? Probably operated on two registers that complemented each other. The first was through some as yet unknown set of rituals involving water and perhaps fire too, based on a very limited number of altars that had been found. Harappan rituals constituted a highly regulated set of practices guided by the authorizing voice of moral, innate, eternal, and inescapable power. The second register can be seen in the well-adapted routines of everyday life, especially the production of standardized objects, the pattern structures in well-ordered cities, and perhaps the exemplar simplicity of a priestly class. So cities, of course, are sites of accumulation. They generate organizational forces of their own through processes of what Ed Soja and Jane Jacobs have called cynicism, and act as important nodal centers for building corridors of network power. In many periods and across geographical contexts, merchants, priests, entrepreneurs, and financiers made up the interlocking elites in cities, and were also and continue to be connected across distance. For over 700 years, small but increasingly powerful groups of traders may have made strategic moves to initiate systemic forms of urban planning, means to organize labor for industrial scale production of items of trade, which were presumably dominated by gemstones, beads, and necklaces in the case of Harappa, but also potentially goods that have long since perished, including crops such as indigo and turmeric, textiles, rosewood, and furniture. Together, these may have ended up creating fetishized ritual patterns that serve to congeal into social structures such as kinship rules, primogeniture, forms of capital, and relations of production and exchange, and possibly also conditions to establish sovereign right, sacred spaces, and so on. These practices would have comprised an ideology of ceremonial complexes that reinforced elite authority. Proximity promotes the formation of dense, differentiated populations, with the most successful ones being those that are extensively connected with the outside. In the case of Harappa, elite seal bearers might have been the agents of transaction with Mesopotamia. Trade in beads may have been a singular route to generating economic surplus, but this was likely accompanied by a further differentiation of roles and control that remain an archaeological enigma. So moving forward now several millennia, we see clear evidence for anxiety in the case of this discourse on Dharma around ethical justification for what were by then well-established violent practices of territorial sovereignty. Both Yudhishthira and Ashoka wanted to be charged themselves with war crimes as war criminals. Ashoka found recourse in promulgating the Buddhist Dharma, but Dharmaputra, the son of Dharma, Yudhishthira, was torn between what was deemed his own sacred duty or the interlaced power of Brahmanism and his moral sentiment of social responsibility, of bearing social responsibility. And you see these multiple interactions during this very complex period, which I have termed Dharma Yoga. What we see here is a bit of a distraction, but not too much, I hope. It's based on work by a PhD student of Professor Parthapratim and myself, Aishwarya Raman. And Aishwarya has been researching several large farmer producer organizations in Tamil Nadu. And these diagrams represent two such natural farming networks of or FPCs, farmer producer organizations that focus on natural farming. But the one on the left was built out of traditional patriarchal farmer relationships. So the FPO emerged out of an existing structure. But the one on the right was deliberately initiated by a few NGOs and women's self-help groups to very deliberately and self-consciously build networks of cooperation around farming techniques, materials, and exchange. And so if you're a network analyst, what you'll see in these diagrams is on the left, you see gatekeepers or bridging centrality. You see a very sparse network. And so you need this morphology in order to create structures of elite power. Whereas the one on the right, very difficult to find such nodes of centrality emerge. And there's other work done on elite structure and so on. This for instance comes from Murray Milner, and he's pointing here to ways in which different classes of elites may face threats from the outside or within or from within, but that these aren't mechanical processes, but are themselves replete with political strategies. So this constant readjustment of elites and their relational connections make up a lot of what we know about political history. For instance, Charles Tilly says absolutism in Europe from the 16th to 19th centuries was one such elite strategy and resulted in, quote, feudal partitioning, consolidation of power with the monarch, rise of state power, unification of the state laws, and a decrease in the influence of the church and the nobility. So you see these network effects having emergent outcomes, social and cultural outcomes. And so it's not the same process or strategy leading to identical conditions every single time. So one can have a lot of fun with these kinds of network relationships. And this particular one took me some time to draw, only because I lack visual design skills. But it turned out that organizing the connections was actually a very simple matter, and doing it actually shocked me, made me realize that Trump had become a kind of a bogeyman for endemic modes of corruption in America. So C. Wright Mills, was very perceptive on this score. And here's the pertinent quote from his Power Elite, and I start, quote, "The inner core of the power elite consists first of those who interchange commanding roles at the top of one dominant institutional order with those in another. The admiral who's also a banker, and a lawyer who's also heads up an important federal commission, the corporation executive whose company was one of the 2 or 3 leading war material producers and who is now Secretary of Defense, the wartime general who dons civilian clothes to sit on the political directorate and then becomes a member of the board of directors of a leading economic corporation." So moving on now to the 16th to 18th centuries in Mughal India, the Mansadari or rank holding system was built on the size of the military retinue the rank holder could command. So Mansabs were highly salaried people who were also given jagirs or control over land and rights to collect revenue, and were thereby a brilliant spatially networked elite group of provincial state actors who were directly linked to the imperial court from across the subcontinent. They included various men of status, including defeated rajas, Brahmin and Kayast administrators, and even literary figures across religions. Alongside them was a military, police, and revenue infrastructure that was managed by a retinue of petty officials. The government of men by other men under Akbar thus formed a parallel aristocracy to the old fractured feudal nobility of kinship-based connections, but it mostly functioned as a similar, though more efficient system of clientelism that had been going on for some time, and which forced tribute-generating vassals and rajas to steer their revenues towards Delhi. Akbar's attempt to bring about coherence and peace within this complex aristocracy was fraught with difficulty. Muzaffar Alam writes, quote, "In a number of cases, the nobles began to seek avenues to build their fortunes in obvious disregard of the principles defining their powers and positions. There were other renegades too. Chris Bailey and Sanjay Subramaniam used the term portfolio capitalist to describe a special type of merchant who mobilized substantial financial and military resources, diversified their fortunes geographically, and maintained effective control over vast territory and mobile networks. One such portfolio capitalist, the 17th century merchant prince Muhammad Sayyid, had direct contact with both the Mughal prince Aurangzeb and the Safavid Shah of Isfahan. He also served as a vizier in the court of the Sultan of Golconda in the Deccan until he defected to join the Mughal emperor. Sayyids after Aurangzeb were also made vizier and bakshi, or treasury secretary, giving them substantial control over matters of state. So altogether, a new pattern of township was also emerging through these processes, replacing the kasbah, Sufi hospices, which comprised families of Islamic soldiers, administrators, and learned men. The new trading centers were mostly Hindu in character, but whose trade routes were also subject to marauding attacks by Jats and others. Sometimes appeasement was sought through bribery. Right? So alongside all this, new archetypes of manhood were emerging in towns and cities of post-Aurangzeb North India. And here I rely on Rosalind O'Hanlon's analysis, and she writes that one archetype had a longer history than the others and was characterized as heroic striving in the service of empire. So the Mansab and Nawab, or provincial governor, and these had antipodal qualities of refined Persian courtly skills plus warrior traditions of the self-trained fighter from the Central Asian steppe. But other opposing ideals of manliness also seem to arise. For instance, Kayast and Brahmin administrators in the Mughal regime were reconstituted as gentlemen of repute and even military strength, as demonstrated in the rise of the Peshwa or Brahmin ministers as warrior kings' successors. Similarly, against the foppish and elaborately robed Mughal princes and Nawabs, O'Hanlon describes the Nawab of Farrukhabad, Muhammad Khan Bangash, whose ways of living symbolized martial simplicity. And you see a similar kind of note in Chris Bailey's work in Rulers, Townsmen, and Bazaars, and I quote, "The incoming colonial power and European traders succeeded when they were able to cajole, entice, and manipulate these intermediate groups." So these cultural practices were very convenient. British conquest often meant no more than the slow drift to the East India Company of soldiers, merchants, and administrators, leaving the Indian rulers with nothing more than a husk of royal grandeur. The social politics of pre-colonial India will become much clearer when the relationship between state, commerce, and peasant society is thus understood. So now what we come to is a kind of a history of capitalism, but it's a capitalism that has acquired a planetary agency. And Jean-Francois Bayard uses this term extraversion to describe these strategies deployed by those in the periphery who tried to secure themselves with powerful figures of the metropolis. So nimble locals managed to mobilize resources, including coercion, deceit, and negotiation skills in their contact with external agents, which in turn secured positions of prestige for themselves, along with other advantages of entry into the external world. In early colonial history, these alliances helped secure significant nodes of privilege, maintaining local satraps in power through some combination of violence and persuasion. Over time and across diverse societies, these groups developed into extensive networks of influence and exchange, often negotiated over large geographies through formal and informal contracts that were so obscure that the actual operations of political authority and control could be very nearly impossible to detect. So extraversion is, in more general sense, is a strategy that evolved and created new ways for the maturation and practices of elites in different situations that could reach across from their own positions and localities of power to other levels and political scales in order to maintain and secure additional resources. So I won't go on with this line of thinking because I am conscious of the time. And here we've moved forward again to the contemporary period where I've got this collage of figures, and I apologize for the size, but let me try and explain them very quickly. They're all pointing to the same thing, through the elite consolidation of wealth, in this case, control over wealth, which James Gladfelder has been documenting for some time now, with great visual impact. Really, this is showing a very small number of people having these bow tie types of relationships, but effectively controlling a very large amount of global wealth. And these are some of the organizations involved, and the chain of network ownership relationships is over leveraged among remarkably small groups of actors. So these bridging ties, these bridging centrality, plus a whole series of other strategies have been very important in creating or resulting in these kinds of morphologies. And you see other state effects, if you like, that help facilitate these processes. So how should we end this? I like to use Greta Thunberg's words, and because they're so perceptive in showing this relationship between structures of elite power and emergent devastating effects for the rest of human society. So she says, they invite cherry-picked young people to meetings like this to pretend that they listen to us, but they clearly don't listen to us. Our emissions are still rising. The science doesn't lie. We can no longer let the people in power decide what is politically possible. We can no longer let the people in power decide what hope is. Hope is not passive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action. And hope always comes from the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajan. That was really terrific. And I invite the audience to start putting in their questions or comments in the question and answer box. Just to get the discussion started, I thought maybe I'll put a few questions to you first. I really enjoyed reading your book. And I thought this sort of, it was very interesting to see this kind of sort of ambitious historical sociology for South Asia. But there were a couple of, so these are really sort of more clarifications than real questions, because I was wondering if you could clarify what appeared to me a bit of a contradiction between understanding corruption at a structural level that you were trying to move towards, which is, it's not just about individual failing, but it's about a systemic question of elite control and networked elite control, and the notion of, corruption as degeneration, social degeneration. Because you see, if you want us to understand corruption at a structural level, then the notion of degeneration assumes that there is a more pristine structural order which is collapsing into its corruption. But how can corruption be fundamental to the structure as well as a fall from the structure into degeneration? So these senses seem to, if it is fundamental to the design of the social formation, then shouldn't the design go out in its entirety, And if corruption is, however, a fall from some purer form, political form, then we cannot attribute corruption to the structure, but only moral lapses of elites. But so that was one kind of question which I was thinking about while reading your book. But this led to sort of two more sort of observations, which was that if one is moving towards understanding a structural understanding of corruption, then does the word corruption itself remain useful? Shouldn't we then just move into calling structures, which is either it's capitalism or it's patriarchy or it's caste or race? So I wondered what is the merit of remaining with the idea of corruption? Um, Also, whether the notion of elite theory of power is really capacious enough to capture all kinds of structures of power. Because, one of the things I felt in your book was that that the picture through every social formation from ancient to contemporary is that of an elite network monopolizing resources and creating discourses that the ordinary people are then consciously or unconsciously implicated in their everyday lives. But at some level, it felt like this was kind of a moral absolution for the people, you know. But we know from our understanding of patriarchy and how caste operates, especially as Ambedkar puts it, in the form of a graded inequality, that there are structures of power that are not reducible to the elite theory, as it were. So I was wondering how you think this frame can, whether you think this frame is truly that capacious or not. But these are just some initial thoughts, and we can maybe start off with um,
These are really brilliant questions. Thank you, and they're connected to each other as I see them, and so thank you for expressing them in precisely this way. So I tried to sort of parse them into three themes. The first around this relationship between social structure and elite agency, as it were, right? And whether one ought to sort of maintain that as a kind of a living figuration. And this is where I find the work of people like Norbert Elias to be most useful, because indeed the agency structure question is in a sense bypassed in his formulation of the figuration, because we're not talking about social objects, but social processes that are constantly sort of creating emergent effects and outcomes, but where power is continuously sort of operating within these figurations. And I'm wondering whether that kind of conception is a better formulation than mine of using this word corruption. And yet I want to insist on it precisely because I'm wedded to Machiavelli's understanding of corruption in Discourses on Livy, where what he's trying to ask or trying to define is, how can we do better politically? How can we be a Republican society if the people are continuously corrupt? I mean, he uses the word corruption, dozens of times in the book, but almost invariably only in relation to the corruption of the people. He's not really bothered about the prince being corrupt, because that's a given. He's already laid out that strategy of how the prince could maintain his sort of singular domination and the means through which he kind of achieves what I think Gramsci later describes as the hegemonic processes, right? And I'm not sure that Machiavelli always pulls this off correctly, but I think he gives us something to think about, where yes, it is the patrici who are, in a sense, formulating strategies, developing laws. Even the 12 tables were written by the patrici, not by the plebeians. So Roman law was constituted as forms of accommodation, but they are ultimately also means of betrayal. And so this question of societal degeneration or corruption seems to me to be an interesting political way to sort of lament the comeuppance of the elites every single time. And it's in the long historical processes, I mean, or long durée rather, that we start to see the sort of the indelible marks of elite network phenomena, so to speak, and that's where, you know, and again, I have no skills to actually demonstrate this, but I think what an Elias or somebody in court society can help us understand is the manner in which bodily habitus, you know, social practice, cultures sort of help sort of reinscribe the modes of territoriality. So I think that's the sort of connection that I want to sort of build across these overlapping concepts. And again, you know, I'm always striving to sort of get the right vocabulary to pull this together. But at the same time, I feel, you know, it's historians and anthropologists who actually have the tools to uncover these insights far more than I can. So I don't know if I've answered
Thank you.
the questions, but then there's still this third about the capaciousness of the concept.
But maybe we could take some questions from the audience and we can have a conversation later. Yeah, so let me take a question. This is a question from Anubha Anushri, who's a grad student at the Department of History and actually works on the history of corruption and bureaucracy in colonial India. She has two questions. The first is, and I'm reading out now, you talk about the universal syndrome of corruption. One possible outcome of such interpretation is to see corruption as pervasive but diffused. I wonder how does one think about with this conceptual method in the 21st century, as Pandora and Panama Papers have revealed, corruption is pervasive but hard to identify, leading to a convenient policy paralysis. How would one think of regulating corruption if it was so pervasive? The second question is from her. She writes, I am curious to know your thoughts on the connection between democracy and corruption. Modern democracies are fundamentally built on attempts to control corruption, articulated via the institution of checks and balances and independence of institutions, but especially the first world ones also place a lot of emphasis on free market and privacy of citizenship. I wonder if you could talk about modern democracies and the specific forms of corruption they engender.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you, Anushri. In terms of the universality of corruption, I think it's at what level of generality we want to talk about this universality. I understand that if we go to a very broad, you know, generic sort of understanding of elite structures and being pervasive and everywhere, then it's not very useful. It's no longer a useful category. And that's why I like you know, the work of Charles Tilly and James C. Scott in particular. And Scott points out that it's really territorializing strategies, which were, you know, very unfamiliar to human societies until about until the, you know, the true expansion of imperialism with colonialism. That territory wasn't seen as a really significant mode of you know, conditions of life, and so because the bulk of human populations lived, you know, knew the arts of not being governed, as Scott would say, and so if we start narrowing down this question of corruption in the way in which I'm defining it to the territorializing impulse, then I think we start to, you know, gain some more insights into what these elite strategies might have been and why they became so, you know, powerful. I mean, you might want to start asking why are they such, you know, such oversized parts of our historical imaginations even today. So that's something that I think bears more explanation, more and exploration, and I don't have the means to suggest anything further, I'm afraid. But on democracy and corruption, absolutely, so democracy is the sort of the popular political response to grand corruption, has been for arguably, centuries, if not millennia. What I find very interesting in reading about Athenian democracy in particular is the attempt to sort of counter, to use so what Arlene Saxonhouse calls, the free patterns of free speech, patterns of defiance to conventional order. So what the way Machiavelli would describe it is that the degeneration of moral order in the name of social order is corruption, meaning you justify a particular social order even though you know that you are in the process, being unjust. And so, Socrates' apology sort of characterizes that democratic impulse, that within a putative democratic society, he has to sort of defend the right to oppose, to opposition. And this I think is I mean, to me, I think Hegel is very interesting in this context. There's a lot more I feel that needs exploration in terms of what's the relationship between democracy and corruption. One of my great heroes, academic heroes in this field, Michael Johnston, his most recent book was on democracy. He's been writing for 30 years on corruption, and then he turns around and talks about, what does democracy look like? And in the post-Trump era, it's very, very difficult to actually defend a version of liberal democracy. And so then, questions of deliberative democracy, not so much direct democracy, because we know how that can be corrupted, but these other modes is something that I think, definitely bear attention as ways to combat corruption.
Thank you, Professor. There's one last question that I'll take. This is from Siddharth Sachdeva. It says, and I'm reading, the work on FPO networks in Tamil Nadu is truly incredible. I was wondering if you could speak to what social factors you think caused Tamil Nadu to have such high levels of adoption of natural farming and agroforestry, and whether you think it can be replicated in other states. Thank you for this wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. I mean, in the context of natural farming, Andhra Pradesh is the leader. Andhra Pradesh has a very robust program on agroecology and natural farming, and they're also using these farmer-producer organization networks in very effective ways. It's largely a state-directed program, but there's been a lot of learning from the ground and from farmer networks and various NGO groups and so on. Tamil Nadu is actually a laggard in this area, but among, I mean, there are there is a growing set of actors and farmer-producer organizations, and the ones that were described in this study are actually, they make up the minority of farmer-producer corporations in the state. So that's also something to be noted. So Aishwarya was looking particularly to see, whether these progressive organizations can also be, networked differently, and it turns out that they can be.
Maybe I think we could take a couple of more minutes for one last question, maybe. Yeah, if that's okay. Yeah, it's from an anonymous attendee, and I'm reading out. Often when the influence of the elites and the lack of transparency are mentioned in public discourse, they are countered with the notion of conspiracy theory. It often appears in Wikipedia, for instance, where proponents of edits highlighting elite cooperation are called conspiracy theorists and disregarded, limiting public access to information. What could be done to explain and define this term? How does popular notion of conspiracy fit into your theories of power? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, I don't quite know how to respond to that, except to say that if you actually look at the reports on, say, the Panama Papers, where they uncovered more than 12 million documents, and you actually look at what they revealed, nobody could have dreamt this up, and certainly not QAnon, right? There are lots of such examples. The Montesinos case in Peru, where the police chief for Fujimori, Vladimiro Montesinos, he secretly recorded every one of the transactions he made, and he made tens of thousands of transactions in hotel rooms with judges, lawyers, members of the media, company executives, party officials, a whole host of others. There's Luis Ocampo has documented all this, and you see, these very intense networks, and you see how they're sort of enmeshed and entangled with corridors of power internationally. And again, no conspiracy could have uncovered or could have sort of dreamt up such a story. So I think this is one of those cases where truth is stranger than fiction. So I wouldn't worry so much about that label of conspiracy when it comes to the existing corrupt. I mean, again, think about climate change and the Exxon files. Right? ExxonMobil and Chevron and Shell knew about climate change long before they confessed it. In fact, they were secretly lobbying, against the science. So, and this we've seen with the tobacco industry and so on. So, we really have lots of evidence that these are intricacies that can't really be dreamt of or dreamt up.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajan. I want to thank Simrat and Lalita for doing all of this wonderful organizing of this talk, and Professor Rajan for this wonderful discussion, and to the audience for your wonderful questions. Thank you so much.